I'm Eric Hansen, and welcome to our concert. And before each concert, I get up and talk for a few minutes in advance of the program, as well as before each of the pieces, giving some program notes in addition to the wonderful notes you see in your program. And so I did want to welcome you all before the concert, and thank you for coming, and thank you for being here, not here, but here. And I hope you are all leading, as interesting, curious lives as you possibly can during this difficult time. On our program, we have 3 works, which is relatively common for the orchestra. Many of our programs have 3 works, and quite often they're very, very different because, of course, every composer is different, even within one particular era of time. Say, Haydn, late Haydn, and Mozart and early Beethoven. It's all pretty much within 10 years or so at the end of the 18th century. But here we have a program with 3 different composers, 3 different pieces, of course, radically different pieces. And also, this is relatively rare for the orchestra, I have to admit, they are all 20th century works. The orchestra doesn't just do, as we jokingly say, music by very dead white European composers. That's a joke, by the way, sorry, I don't mean to offend anybody, because, right. But in this instance, we're actually doing pieces by composers who unfortunately, none of them are alive, but the 2 of the works, the first and the third, were actually composed within 4 or 5 years of each other. Lily Boulanger's piece, 1918, and Carl Nielsen's between 1920 and 1922. And yet, when you hear them, you'll notice that they have very, very little to do with each other in a multitude of ways, not the least of which is that her piece is rather brief and very light, and not flippant, but very, very light and happy. And Nielsen's is a full-length symphony that has the depth and the breadth of any symphonic work that you would want to listen to or expect that you would want to listen to. Contrasting sections, if you will, and different tempi and everything else. And the piece in the middle is just as different, if not, more so, by Boris Papadopoulou. By the way, I practiced that name a lot, in case you're wondering. It didn't take too long, but I kept adding a couple of different syllables to it. I mean, the man was a great composer, and this piece is actually a very mature work that we're playing, the concerto, the second piece on the program, from most likely, the dates are a little bit not sure, but most likely the early 1980s. So we have in this program not only different lengths of works and different stylistic, but very, very much the structures of the pieces are also very wide-ranging. And so I just wanted to kind of address, not so much in a pedagogical way or a lecturing way, so much as talk a little bit about structures in music and how this particular program is rather relevant in the sense that you have a, if you will, a concerto, which is a multi-movement work, and this concerto is very unique. I mean, you probably, I suspect very few of you have heard more than 5 xylophone concertos before. That was a bad joke, sorry. Or a very telling comment, I should say. But most of you have heard 1 or more symphonies, if not dozens, if not hundreds of different performances of, symphonies of Beethoven, of Haydn, etc., Brahms. And then the first piece, which is in fact a tone poem. And the orchestra's done several tone poems. We did one early this year, if you were at our concert where we played In the South by Edward Elgar, very famous, important English composer, end of the 19th century. And that work was a very substantive work of a tone poem, which is a unique structure that appeared pretty much in the mid-19th century, and a number of composers, not all composers the second half of the 19th century composed them. Brahms didn't, for instance. He was more of a traditionalist. A tone poem is a single movement work And it doesn't necessarily have a plot, but frequently the point of the tone poem, at least it's, if you will, the spirit of the piece evokes a kind of a scene, if you will, a tableau or a vignette in this instance of a spring day, which is what the Lily Boulanger piece is. And there may not be a plot, although Richard Strauss, who will be playing on our next program, and did also earlier this year, composed a number of tone poems, and they all had storylines. Don Juan, you know, the man who treats people poorly and ends up going to the wrong place, if you want to call it that. And Till Eulenspiegel, who's a kind of a prankster who also gets in trouble. And there you can literally hear, you know, without seeing the action or hearing people singing, in tone poems you could actually hear the stories, if you will, being played out in just the orchestra itself. In this instance, we just have a vignette, a brief piece, and a wonderful evocative piece. The concerto is in, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around, so bear with me. The concerto, the xylophone concerto, is like many of the early concertos, in other words, a Baroque era, of the era of Vivaldi and Telemann, Bach, and Handel, where the concerto came into prominence, was basically formed and advanced specifically by Vivaldi, the great Italian master. And in this instance, we have a return to the four-movement concerto, but they're in contrast, and they're very much almost like, if you will, the format of a symphony. So the first movement is fast and lively. It develops some ideas. You're introduced to different characters in the form of different melodies. The second movement is very leisurely, slow, and exquisite, beautiful, passionate. The third movement is a dance movement, very typical of the symphony, where the early symphonies of the sons of Bach, before Mozart and when Haydn was very, very young. The third movement was a dance movement, and early on a minuet. Beethoven sped it up into a scherzo, so it's much more quick. And so we have actually, if you will, a kind of a waltz-like third movement in the concerto. And then the last movement is very quick, fast movement, also very typical of the last movement of symphonies. The Nielsen, however, part of what I wanted to relay to you is that if you're used to the standard format of movements, which I pretty much just described, that comes from Haydn and Mozart's time, even with the radical changes that take place as a result of Beethoven's progressing forward the symphonic form, and of course Schumann and Brahms, and any of a number of great symphonic composers throughout the 19th century into the 20th, Prokofiev, Shostakovich. With the Nielsen, it's rather unique. And you'll notice when you look at the program before the second half, if you haven't already, that the piece is actually in two large parts. And this may not be a big deal to you, but it is somewhat to the orchestra, as well as the myriad different aspects of the compositional style of Nielsen. And so the first part of the Nielsen, if you will, the first half, if you want to call it that, or first large section, has two subsections, which are in a sense very typical. You're introduced at the beginning of the first part to several different subjects. There's a kind of a mood, it's a flowing, and then the second half of the first part, sorry. Now I said to the orchestra, I might sound like a lawyer talking about the first party and the second party and the third part, and lose people at the first turn. But the second part is a slow, very typical adagio section of this first huge half of the symphony. Then the second half has four subsections. It's very, very unique. It's, if you will, kind of an Oreo cookie in the sense that the opening of these four parts and the closing are very, very similar. It's like the beginning that comes back. But then it has a fugue. It has two fugues, in fact, a fast fugue and then a slow fugue. And I didn't want to take time to talk about this, but this is a form. Fugues are very, very complicated, dense. They're very much like constructed ivy, if you will. And depending upon how many players there are, how many different what's called voices, they can be very, very powerful and very dense. All the Baroque composers wrote fugues, and some composers after their time did as well. And Nielsen kind of retakes this form and refashions it. One of the other unique aspects to this is the harmony. And harmony, of course, has to do with the different key areas. Composers frequently will have in a symphony 3 or 4 movements, and all of the movements will be in related, if you will, first cousin harmonies. So it's kind of like a gigantic version of Louie Louie, where you've got what's called a 1 chord and then a 4 and a 5. And I can't sing multiple notes, but you basically go through this collective of chords, which most pop music does, and repeat it over and over again because they're very familiar to the listener. Most of the Beatles tunes kind of went past this, but a lot of popular music even now, and folk music, of course, uses a kind of a simple relationship of 3 chords that kind of repeat a la merry-go-round. And to a certain degree, classical compositions do the same thing, but of course spend more time, each of the movements is in one of these related key areas. Then they move around. Nielsen pretty much dispenses with this, and part of the difficulty for us as players, and perhaps for you, the listeners, is to following the harmony as it kind of shifts and moves. It's really much more DNA-like in that it's very, very complicated. But he always knows where he's going, and, well, we hope so, he's the composer. And so this lends itself to not just the complexity of the piece, but in fact, it's an incredible construction. I mean, I consider personally Nielsen one of the great symphonic composers of the last 200-something years, as long as there have been symphonies composed. And he composed 6, and we've done several others before. This is our first time tackling the 5th, which is probably the most advanced and the most intricate. One thing that he shares with most of the other Scandinavian, Nielsen was Danish, that he shares with other Scandinavian composers, and such as Sibelius, and to a certain degree Grieg, Edvard Grieg, is his melodies are beautiful, they're tuneful, but sometimes, frequently, they're tinged with a little bit of a sense of melancholy. I don't know if it's the long winters with a short sun, who knows. But they're very beautiful. He could also be kind of light and carefree. Nevertheless, this piece is a complicated work, as I mentioned, so I hope you enjoy it. The concerto, I just want to, I'll of course not repeat these comments, but add a few extra comments before each piece when we perform throughout the concert. And I did want to mention, and you'll probably note it, that also rather unique to this year, we have actually 2 different, well, a total of 3 soloist winners of our youth competition, which is pretty rare. We've never had more than 2. In this instance, we had 3, because our last concert we had 2 sisters who played the Brahms double concerto. And this concert we will be featuring the xylophone soloist, who's a spectacular player. So I hope you enjoy this. Thank you for coming, and without further ado, we'll be starting soon.